The DOJ's second in command saying there's no basis for opening a criminal civil rights investigation. That statement comes as here in Minnesota, half a dozen federal prosecutors have resigned over the Justice Department's push to investigate Renee Good and her widow.
This is an unmitigated humiliation for Pam Bondi, a moment that will likely be remembered as one of the most revealing collapses of credibility by an attorney general in modern American history. What unfolded was not a quiet internal dispute or a routine staffing shakeup, but a very public implosion that exposed how deeply politicized, corrosive, and ethically bankrupt the Department of Justice has become under her leadership. The resignations of 6 top federal prosecutors in Minnesota were not isolated departures or coincidental timing. These were seasoned professionals, people who had devoted their careers to enforcing the law without fear or favor, and many of them had been directly involved in complex fraud investigations initiated during the Biden administration to root out systemic corruption in Minnesota.
There's never been this many people in this many leadership positions to all resign at one time.
On Tuesday, Joe Thompson and 5 other federal prosecutors resigned because of how the Department of Justice is handling the investigation of Renee Good's death after pushing state investigators out.
Those investigations were not trivial, nor were they partisan hit jobs. They were grounded in evidence, years of work, and the basic principle that fraud, regardless of who commits it or where it occurs, must be investigated and prosecuted. Fraud exists in many states, but Minnesota had become a focal point precisely because of the scale and seriousness of the alleged misconduct. These prosecutors were the institutional memory, the legal backbone of those cases, and suddenly they were gone, not because the cases collapsed or evidence evaporated, but because Pam Bondi and the Trump-aligned DOJ demanded that they abandon legitimate investigations and instead pursue something far more grotesque, the criminal investigation of the widow of Renee Nicole Good. Rather than investigate the officer or rogue ICE agent,
that's according to this New York Times report, confirmed by KARE 11 sources, saying the wave of resignations was triggered by DOJ officials pushing for a criminal investigation into Good's widow. It also says the DOJ is reluctant to investigate the ICE agent who pulled the trigger.
Jonathan Ross, who killed Renee Nicole Good, Bondi's DOJ sought to redirect the full force of federal prosecution against a grieving widow. This was not just a misjudgment. It was a moral atrocity. It was an inversion of justice so stark that it left these prosecutors with an impossible choice: comply with an order they believed to be unethical and unlawful, or walk away.
We support Secretary Noem. We support our men and women of Homeland Security and ICE, who are out there taking predators off the street every day around the country, and they're doing it in Minnesota. What happened in Minnesota? We had 6 prosecutors who suddenly decided they didn't want to support the men and women in ICE.
They chose to walk, and they were not alone. At the same time as the Minnesota resignations, at least 4 or 5 major attorneys resigned from the Civil Rights Division at Main Justice in Washington, D.C. These were not junior lawyers or ideological activists. These were senior professionals who had spent decades defending civil rights and upholding the Constitution. They, too, were ordered not to investigate the killing of Renee Nicole Good and instead to go after her widow. That directive crossed a line so bright and so fundamental that resignation became the only viable option. What we are witnessing is not normal attrition. It is an exodus driven by conscience. The scale of the departures is staggering.
Welcome back. Sources tell CBS News a wave of resignations has hit the Justice Department Civil Rights Division because of a lack of action following the deadly Minneapolis ICE shooting.
The total number of resignations and firings at the Department of Justice is now hovering around 3,000. Just last month, the reported figure was 2,900 attorneys, a number documented by veteran reporter Brad Heath. That alone was unprecedented. More than 2,900 attorneys either quit or were fired during the first 10 months of the year, roughly triple the number that typically leave in an entire year. That figure only accounted for 10 months, and as the weeks have passed, the number has continued to climb. By any reasonable extrapolation, the true total is now closer to 3,000, if not more. This is not a sign of reform or renewal. It is the unmistakable sign of institutional collapse. Faced with this reality, Pam Bondi did not respond with reflection, accountability, or restraint.
ICE was out there risking their lives. So they came, they said, we want to resign, but we want to use our annual leave up until April, meaning they wanted the taxpayers to pay for them to go on vacation because they decided they didn't want to support law enforcement. So the breaking news tonight, I fired them all. They're fired from the office.
Instead, she had a public meltdown. She went on Fox News, specifically Sean Hannity's show, the safest possible venue for a loyalist desperate for affirmation, and proceeded to whine, cry, and lash out. She complained that the prosecutors who resigned were interviewing at liberal law firms, as if seeking future employment somehow invalidated their ethical objections. She recounted almost proudly how she told them they were not allowed to quit, that if they refused to carry out her orders, they would be fired and lose their benefits. This was meant to sound tough. Instead, it sounded petty, vindictive, and unhinged. According to her own telling,
a major shakeup in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Several top prosecutors resigned, including the point man on fraud, Joe Thompson. He and 5 others, including the head of the office's criminal division, Harry Jacobs, all stepped down from their posts.
They responded by quitting anyway. And who can blame them? These were people who refused to be part of what they viewed as a corrupt, weaponized DOJ, an agency being transformed into a political enforcement arm, and worse, into a racketeering enterprise designed to shield powerful abusers while punishing the vulnerable. Bondi's on-air performance was not strength. It was desperation. It was the spectacle of someone who knows she is losing control of her own department and trying to reassert authority through humiliation and threats. The broader context only makes her meltdown more damning. Among those who resigned in Minnesota were the Maine deputy U.S. attorney and multiple line prosecutors who had been central to public safety efforts. Their departure directly undermines the safety of the communities they served. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey made this point with clarity and courage when he confronted Fox News hosts attempting to frame the situation as partisan drama. He cut through the pretense and pointed out that if these prosecutors were corrupt or incompetent, they would not all be resigning en masse. Their resignations, he explained, make the city less safe, not more. And he challenged the network's performative concern about fraud by asking why. If Fox truly cared about accountability, it was ignoring the fact that the very prosecutors investigating fraud were being driven out. As if that were not enough, Pam Bondi's appearance on Hannity also included her defense of another extraordinary abuse of power, the FBI's execution of a search warrant at the home of a Washington Post reporter, Hannah Natanson. Natanson is widely known as one of the most well-sourced journalists covering the federal government, often referred to as a whisperer because of her extensive network of insiders and whistleblowers. Over time, she had cultivated more than 1,000 sources within the federal government, many of whom were exposing illegal and unethical conduct by Trump-aligned officials and initiatives like DOJ. These were not leaks for gossip. They were disclosures about criminal acts occurring inside the government itself. Under Bondi's direction, the FBI raided Natanson's home, seized her phones, her personal laptops, and her work devices. The purpose was obvious and chilling: to identify and intimidate her confidential sources. When asked about this on air, Bondi shrugged it off as perfectly normal, just what we do, as if the targeting of journalists were a routine and acceptable function of a democratic justice system. It was an admission so stark that it should have triggered immediate alarm across the political spectrum. Instead, it was met with nods and silence from a compliant media ally. Meanwhile, Trump and Bondi dispatched their loyalists, MAGA-aligned Republican operatives, to Washington to deflect and obfuscate. These were the same figures who have repeatedly stonewalled questions about the DOJ's refusal to release the Epstein files, in direct violation of the Epstein Transparency Act. When pressed, figures like Lauren Boebert claimed that the DOJ had released quite a bit of information. In reality, less than 1% of the records have been made public. The rest remain locked away, protected by a DOJ leadership that appears more concerned with shielding powerful figures than with delivering justice to victims of a global child sex trafficking ring. All of this paints a devastating picture. A Justice Department hemorrhaging talent, career prosecutors fleeing rather than participate in what they see as corruption, a sitting Attorney General melting down on partisan television, bragging about firing ethical lawyers, defending raids on journalists, and dismissing legitimate concerns about transparency and accountability. This is not the behavior of a stable institution or a confident leader. It is the behavior of a regime in crisis, lashing out as its legitimacy erodes. What makes it truly horrifying is not just the incompetence or cruelty on display, but the normalization of it. Pam Bondi's actions suggest a DOJ no longer guided by law, but by loyalty. A department willing to target widows instead of killers, journalists instead of criminals, and whistleblowers instead of abusers. The resignations are not the problem. They are the warning. And the fact that thousands of attorneys have decided that walking away is preferable to staying should tell the country everything it needs to know about the state of justice in America right now. And the danger here goes far beyond Pam Bondi's personal humiliation or her increasingly erratic public behavior. What we are witnessing is the deliberate hollowing out of the rule of law, a transformation of the Department of Justice from an independent institution into a blunt political weapon. When thousands of career attorneys leave en masse, they take with them institutional knowledge, expertise, and the quiet integrity that keeps a democracy functioning, even when politics becomes toxic. Those losses are not easily replaced, and they are certainly not replaced by loyalty hires whose primary qualification is obedience rather than competence. Inside the DOJ, the atmosphere has reportedly become one of fear and silence. Attorneys who remain describe an environment where questioning directives is seen as insubordination, where ethical concerns are dismissed as partisan whining, and where the safest course of action is to keep your head down and hope you are not next. This is how corruption entrenches itself, not through a single dramatic act, but through sustained pressure that drives out anyone unwilling to comply. Pam Bondi's public tantrum on television was simply the external expression of what has been happening internally for months, a leadership style rooted in intimidation rather than law. The Minnesota resignations are especially illustrative because they reveal how these dynamics play out on the ground. These prosecutors were not political appointees cycling out with a change in administration. They were deeply embedded in their communities, working on cases that directly affected public safety, financial integrity, and trust in government. By demanding that they drop legitimate fraud investigations and instead pursue a grieving widow, the DOJ was effectively asking them to participate in what many legal experts would consider prosecutorial misconduct. Their refusal was not an act of defiance, it was an act of professional survival. Pam Bondi's response to accuse them of disloyalty, to mock their career prospects, and to strip them of benefits reveals a profound misunderstanding of the role of an attorney general. The job is not to enforce personal vendettas or protect political allies. It is to uphold the law impartially. Yet every move she makes suggests that impartiality has been abandoned entirely. The message to remaining DOJ staff is unmistakable. Your duty is not to the Constitution, but to the political objectives of the administration. The targeting of journalists like Hannah Nathanson marks an even darker escalation. A free press is not a nuisance to be managed. It is a cornerstone of democratic accountability. When the DOJ authorizes raids designed to uncover confidential sources, it sends a chilling signal to every whistleblower in government. Speak up, and you will be exposed. Tell the truth, and you will be punished. This is authoritarian behavior, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of law enforcement. What makes Bondi's casual defense of that raid so alarming is her apparent belief that the public will accept it. On Hannity, she spoke as if these actions were routine, as if Americans should simply shrug and move on. That assumption rests on the idea that outrage fatigue has set in, that the sheer volume of scandals has numbed the public to each new abuse. But the scale of the DOJ resignations suggests otherwise. Inside the system, people are not numb. They are alarmed enough to walk away from prestigious, stable careers rather than continue participating. The Epstein Files controversy only compounds this sense of rot. The Epstein Transparency Act was meant to ensure that the public would finally see the full scope of a criminal network that operated with impunity for decades. Instead, the DOJ under Bondi has slow-walked, redacted, and effectively buried the overwhelming majority of the records. When confronted, administration allies offer vague reassurances and outright falsehoods, claiming progress where there is virtually none. This selective transparency reinforces the perception that the DOJ is protecting powerful interests at the expense of victims. Taken together, these events form a coherent pattern. Prosecutors who investigate fraud are pushed out. Civil rights attorneys who refuse to look the other way when a woman is killed are forced to resign. Journalists who expose wrongdoing are raided. Files implicating elites in horrific crimes are withheld. And through it all, Pam Bondi goes on friendly television to cry, complain, and portray herself as the victim. It is a performance that might play well to a partisan audience, but it collapses under even minimal scrutiny. History is unlikely to be kind to this moment. Attorney generals are remembered not for their loyalty to presidents, but for their fidelity to the law. Those who bend the DOJ to political ends rarely escape lasting damage to their reputations. More importantly, they leave behind institutions weakened and mistrusted, requiring years, sometimes decades, to rebuild. The damage being done now will outlast any single administration. And yet, there is an unintended consequence that may ultimately undermine this project of control. Every resignation is also a form of testimony. Every attorney who walks away rather than comply is making a silent but powerful statement about what they were asked to do. Those stories do not disappear, they accumulate. They resurface in court filings, congressional testimony, investigative reporting, and eventually history books. The more aggressively Pam Bondi tries to suppress dissent, the more evidence she creates of why that dissent exists. This is why her meltdown matters. It was not just embarrassing, it was revealing. It showed a leader under pressure, losing allies faster than she can replace them, resorting to threats and tears instead of answers. It exposed a Justice Department in crisis, bleeding credibility at a moment when the country needs it most, and it underscored a grim truth. When justice becomes a tool of power rather than a check on it, the system does not quietly degrade. It fractures loudly and visibly, exactly as we are seeing now. And the fracture is accelerating because the consequences are no longer abstract. They are measurable, visible, and deeply destabilizing. Federal courts are already feeling the strain as cases are delayed, dismissed, or reassigned due to the sudden absence of experienced prosecutors. Victims of fraud, civil rights violations, and violent crimes are being told to wait, not because justice is complicated, but because the people who knew how to pursue it are gone. This is what happens when an institution is gutted from the inside out. The public pays the price while those responsible deflect blame and insist everything is fine. Pam Bondi's defenders like to frame this as a necessary purge, a cleansing of so-called deep state actors who supposedly sabotaged the administration. But that narrative collapses when you look at who is leaving. These are not partisan operatives. These are career attorneys who served under Republican and Democratic administrations alike, who stayed through transitions precisely because they believed in the mission of the DOJ. If this were merely ideological disagreement, you would see staggered departures, quiet retirements, internal transfers. Instead, you see clusters of resignations tied to specific orders, specific cases, and specific ethical red lines. That pattern tells the real story. The Renee Nicole Good case has become emblematic of that story because it strips away all pretense. There is no credible legal theory that justifies targeting a widow while shielding the individual who killed her. There is no version of justice in which that makes sense. And yet, Bondi's DOJ pushed forward anyway, apparently confident that political loyalty would outweigh professional ethics. They miscalculated. The resignations were the system's immune response, a last-ditch effort to reject an infection before it spreads further. What makes the situation even more volatile is that these departures are happening alongside growing public awareness. Unlike past internal DOJ controversies that unfolded quietly, this one is playing out in real time, amplified by local leaders, journalists, and former officials who are no longer constrained by institutional silence. When mayors, former prosecutors, and legal scholars all start saying the same thing, that the DOJ has been commandeered for political ends, it becomes much harder to dismiss the criticism as noise. Bondi's media strategy only exacerbates the problem. Every appearance on friendly outlets reinforces the impression that she is more concerned with grievance than governance. Her fixation on where former prosecutors might work next, her complaints about being defied, her emotional appeals to partisan hosts all project insecurity rather than authority. An attorney general confident in her legal footing would welcome scrutiny, point to statutes and precedents, and calmly defend her decisions. Bondi does none of that. Instead, she vents, threatens, and personalizes every conflict. That personalization is dangerous because it turns the machinery of justice into an extension of individual ego. When decisions are driven by loyalty tests and perceived slights, the law becomes secondary. This is precisely why the DOJ was designed to be insulated from political pressure in the first place. The framers understood that justice cannot function if prosecutors fear retaliation for doing their jobs. The current exodus suggests that fear has become institutionalized. The chilling effect extends beyond the DOJ itself. State and local law enforcement agencies that rely on federal partnerships are now questioning whether those relationships are safe or reliable. Whistleblowers inside other agencies are reconsidering whether coming forward is worth the risk after watching a journalist's home raided for doing her job. Even judges, traditionally cautious in their public remarks, have begun expressing concern in rulings and hearings about the erosion of prosecutorial independence. These are not isolated reactions. They are interconnected responses to a single source of instability. And looming over all of it is the unresolved question of accountability. Historically, DOJ abuses eventually trigger investigations, inspector general reports, congressional hearings, or all three. The more aggressively leadership tries to suppress information, the more severe those reckonings tend to be. Every email, every directive, every recorded conversation becomes potential evidence. The irony is that in attempting to control the narrative, Bondi and her allies may be creating an extensive paper trail that documents exactly how and why the DOJ was politicized. This is why the resignations matter more than any single scandal. They are a collective indictment, not issued in court but in action. They say, without words, that something has gone profoundly wrong. No amount of television appearances or partisan talking points can undo that message. You cannot spin away thousands of departures. You cannot gaslight the public into believing that an institution hemorrhaging its own legal backbone is healthy. In the end, Pam Bondi's meltdown may be remembered less for the tears and more for what it revealed. A justice system under siege from within, a leader unable to command trust, and a moment when the mask slipped far enough for the public to see the machinery underneath. Whether that exposure leads to reform or further decay remains an open question. But what is already clear is that the damage is real, the consequences are ongoing, and the people who chose to walk away did so because they understood something fundamental, that a career is replaceable, but a conscience is not.